Chapter 4. However, as he now fancied, it was because he lacked an education that he had done so poorly. Because of those various moves from city to city in his early youth, he had never been permitted to collect such a sum of practical training in any field as would permit him, so he thought, to aspire to the great worlds of which these men appeared to be a part. Yet his soul now yearned for this. The people who lived in fine houses, who stopped at great hotels, and had men like Mr. Squires, and the manager of the bellhops here, to wait on them and arrange for their comfort. And he was still a bellhop. And close to 21. At times it made him very sad. He wished and wished that he could get into some work where he could rise and be somebody, not always remain a bellhop, as at times he feared he might. About the time that he reached this conclusion in regard to himself and was meditating on some way to improve and safeguard his future, his uncle, Samuel Griffiths, arrived in Chicago. And having connections here which made a card to this club an obvious civility, he came directly to it and for several days was about the place conferring with individuals who came to see him, or hurrying to and fro to meet people and visit concerns whom he deemed it important to see. And it was not an hour after he arrived before Ratterer, who had charge of the pegboard at the door by day and who had but a moment before finished posting the name of this uncle on the board, signaled to Clyde, who came over. "Didn't you say you had an uncle or something by the name of Griffiths in the collar business somewhere in New York State?" "Sure," replied Clyde. "Samuel Griffiths. He has a big collar factory in Lycurgus. That's his ad you see in all the papers and that's his fire sign over there on Michigan Avenue. Would you know him if you saw him?" "No," replied Clyde. "I never saw him in all my life." "I'll bet anything it's the same fellow," commented Ratterer, consulting a small registry slip that had been handed him. "Look-a-here, Samuel Griffiths, Lycurgus, N. Why that's probably the same guy, eh?" "Surest thing you know," added Clyde, very much interested and even excited, for this was the identical uncle about whom he had been thinking so long. "He just went through here a few minutes ago," went on Ratterer. "Devoy took his bags up to K. Swell-looking man, too. You better keep your eye open and take a look at him when he comes down again. Maybe it's your uncle. He's only medium tall and kinda thin. Wears a small gray mustache and a pearl gray hat. Good lookin'. I'll point him out to you. If it is your uncle you better shine up to him. Maybe he'll do somethin' for you, give you a collar or two," he added, laughing. Clyde laughed too as though he very much appreciated this joke, although in reality he was flustered. His Uncle Samuel. And in this club? Well, then this was his opportunity to introduce himself to his uncle. He had intended writing him before ever he secured this place, but now he was here in this club and might speak to him if he chose. But hold. What would his uncle think of him, supposing he chose to introduce himself? For he was a bellboy again and acting in that capacity in this club. What, for instance, might be his uncle's attitude toward boys who worked as bellboys, particularly at his, Clyde's, years? For he was over 20 now, and getting to be pretty old for a bellboy, that is, if one ever intended to be anything else. A man of his wealth and high position might look on bellhopping as menial, particularly bellboys who chanced to be related to him. He might not wish to have anything to do with him, might not even wish him to address him in any way. It was in this state that he remained for fully 24 hours after he knew that his uncle had arrived at this club. The following afternoon, however, after he had seen him at least half a dozen times and had been able to formulate the most agreeable impressions of him, since his uncle appeared to be so very quick, alert, incisive, so very different from his father in every way, and so rich and respected by everyone here, he began to wonder, to fear even at times, whether he was going to let this remarkable opportunity slip. For after all, his uncle did not look to him to be at all unkindly, quite the reverse, very pleasant. And when, at the suggestion of Ratterer, he had gone to his uncle's room to secure a letter which was to be sent by special messenger, his uncle had scarcely looked at him, but instead had handed him the letter and $50. "See that a boy takes that right away and keep the money for yourself," he had remarked. Clyde's excitement was so great at the moment that he wondered that his uncle did not guess that he was his nephew. But plainly he did not. And he went away a little crestfallen. Later, some half-dozen letters for his uncle having been put in the key box, Ratterer called Clyde's attention to them. "If you want to run in on him again, here's your chance. Take those up to him. He's in his room, I think." And Clyde, after some hesitation, had finally taken the letters and gone to his uncle's suite once more. His uncle was writing at the time and merely called, "Come." Then Clyde, entering and smiling rather enigmatically, observed, "Here's some mail for you, Mr. Griffiths." "Thank you very much, my son," replied his uncle and proceeded to finger his vest pocket for change. But Clyde, seizing this opportunity, exclaimed, "Oh, no, I don't want anything for that." And then before his uncle could say anything more, although he proceeded to hold out some silver to him, he added, "I believe I'm related to you, Mr. Griffiths. You're Mr. Samuel Griffiths of the Griffiths Collar Company of Lycurgus, aren't you?" "Yes, I have a little something to do with it, I believe." "Who are you?" returned his uncle, looking at him sharply. "My name's Clyde Griffiths. My father, Asa Griffiths, is your brother, I believe." At the mention of this particular brother, who, to the knowledge of all the members of this family, was distinctly not a success materially, the face of Samuel Griffiths clouded the least trifle. For the mention of Asa brought rather unpleasingly before him the stocky and decidedly not well-groomed figure of his younger brother, whom he had not seen in so many years. His most recent distinct picture of him was as a young man of about Clyde's age about his father's house near Birtwick, Vermont. But how different! Clyde's father was then short, fat and poorly knit mentally as well as physically, oleaginous and a bit mushy, as it were. His chin was not firm, his eyes a pale watery blue, and his hair frizzled. Whereas this son of his was neat, alert, good-looking and seemingly well-mannered and intelligent, as most bellhops were inclined to be, as he noted. And he liked him. However, Samuel Griffiths, who along with his elder brother Alan had inherited the bulk of his father's moderate property, and this because of Joseph Griffiths' prejudice against his youngest son, had always felt that perhaps an injustice had been done Asa. For Asa, not having proved very practical or intelligent, his father had first attempted to drive and then later ignore him, and finally had turned him out at about Clyde's age, and had afterward left the bulk of his property, some $30,000, to these two elder brothers, share and share alike, willing Asa but a petty $1,000. It was this thought in connection with this younger brother that now caused him to stare at Clyde rather curiously. For Clyde, as he could see, was in no way like the younger brother who had been harried from his father's home so many years before. Rather he was more like his own son, Gilbert, whom, as he now saw, he resembled. Also, in spite of all of Clyde's fears, he was obviously impressed by the fact that he should have any kind of place in this interesting club. For to Samuel Griffiths, who was more than less confined to the limited activities and environment of Lycurgus, the character and standing of this particular club was to be respected. And those young men who served the guests of such an institution as this, were, in the main, possessed of efficient and unobtrusive manners. Therefore to see Clyde standing before him in his neat gray and black uniform and with the air of one whose social manners at least were excellent, caused him to think favorably of him. "You don't tell me!" he exclaimed interestedly. "So you're Asa's son? I do declare. Well, now, this is a surprise. You see, I haven't seen or heard from your father in at least, well, say, 25 or 6 years, anyhow. The last time I did hear from him he was living in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I think, or here. He isn't here now, I presume." "Oh, no, sir," replied Clyde, who was glad to be able to say this. "The family live in Denver. I'm here all alone. Your father and mother are living, I presume?" "Yes, sir. They're both alive." "Still connected with religious work, is he, your father?" "Well, yes, "Sir," answered Clyde, a little dubiously, for he was still convinced that the form of religious work his father essayed was of all forms the poorest and most inconsequential socially. "Only the church he has now," he went on, "has a lodging house connected with it. About 40 rooms, I believe. He and my mother run that and the mission too." "Oh, I see." He was so anxious to make a better impression on his uncle than the situation seemed to warrant that he was quite willing to exaggerate a little. "Well, I'm glad they're doing so well," continued Samuel Griffiths, rather impressed with the trim and vigorous appearance of Clyde. "You like this kind of work, I suppose?" "Well, not exactly." "No, Mr. Griffiths, I don't," replied Clyde quickly, alive at once to the possibilities of this query. "It pays well enough. But I don't like the way you have to make the money you get here. It isn't my idea of a salary at all. But I got in this because I didn't have a chance to study any particular work or get in with some company where there was a real chance to work up and make something of myself. My mother wanted me to write you once and ask whether there was any chance in your company for me to begin and work up, but I was afraid maybe that you might not like that exactly, and so I never did." He paused, smiling, and yet with an inquiring look in his eye. His uncle looked solemnly at him for a moment, pleased by his looks and his general manner of approach in this instance, and then replied, "Well, that is very interesting. You should have written, if you wanted to." Then, as was his custom in all matters, he cautiously paused. Clyde noted that he was hesitating to encourage him. "I don't suppose there is anything in your company that you would let me do?" he ventured boldly, after a moment. Samuel Griffiths merely stared at him thoughtfully. He liked and he did not like this direct request. However, Clyde appeared at least a very adaptable person for the purpose. He seemed bright and ambitious, so much like his own son, and he might readily fit into some department as head or assistant under his son, once he had acquired a knowledge of the various manufacturing processes. At any rate, he might let him try it. There could be no real harm in that. Besides, there was his younger brother, to whom, perhaps, both he and his older brother Alan owed some form of obligation, if not exactly restitution. "Well," he said, after a moment, "that is something I would have to think over a little. I wouldn't be able to say, offhand, whether there is or not. We wouldn't be able to pay you as much as you make here to begin with," he warned. "Oh, that's all right," exclaimed Clyde, who was far more fascinated by the thought of connecting himself with his uncle than anything else. "I wouldn't expect very much until I was able to earn it, of course. Besides, it might be that you would find that you didn't like the collar business once you got into it, or we might find we didn't like you. Not everyone is suited to it by a long way." "Well, all you'd have to do then would be to discharge me," assured Clyde. "I've always thought I would be, though, ever since I heard of you and your big company." This last remark pleased Samuel Griffiths. Plainly he and his achievements had stood in the nature of an ideal to this youth. "Very well," he said. "I won't be able to give any more time to this now. But I'll be here for a day or two more, anyhow, and I'll think it over. It may be that I will be able to do something for you. I can't say now." And he turned quite abruptly to his letters. And Clyde, feeling that he had made as good an impression as could be expected under the circumstances and that something might come of it, thanked him profusely and beat a hasty retreat. The next day, having thought it over and deciding that Clyde, because of his briskness and intelligence, was likely to prove as useful as another, Samuel Griffiths, after due deliberation as to the situation at home, informed Clyde that in case any small opening in the home factory occurred he would be glad to notify him. But he would not even go so far as to guarantee him that an opening would immediately be forthcoming. He must wait. Accordingly Clyde was left to speculate as to how soon, if ever, a place in his uncle's factory would be made for him. In the meanwhile Samuel Griffiths had returned to Lycurgus. And after a later conference with his son, he decided that Clyde might be inducted into the very bottom of the business, at least, the basement of the Griffiths plant, where the shrinking of all fabrics used in connection with the manufacture of collars was brought about, and where beginners in this industry who really desired to acquire the technique of it were placed, for it was his idea that Clyde by degrees was to be taught the business from top to bottom. And since he must support himself in some form not absolutely incompatible with the standing of the Griffiths family here in Lycurgus, it was decided to pay him the munificent sum of $15 to begin. For while Samuel Griffiths, as well as his son Gilbert, realized that this was small pay, not for an ordinary apprentice but for Clyde, since he was a relative, yet so inclined were both toward the practical rather than the charitable in connection with all those who worked for them, that the nearer the beginner in this factory was to the clear mark of necessity and compulsion, the better. Neither could tolerate the socialistic theory relative to capitalistic exploitation. As both saw it, there had to be higher and higher social orders to which the lower social classes could aspire. One had to have castes. One was foolishly interfering with and disrupting necessary and unavoidable social standards when one tried to unduly favor anyone, even a relative. It was necessary when dealing with the classes and intelligences below one, commercially or financially, to handle them according to the standards to which they were accustomed. And the best of these standards were those which held these lower individuals to a clear realization of how difficult it was to come by money, to an understanding of how very necessary it was for all who were engaged in what both considered the only really important constructive work of the world, that of material manufacture, to understand how very essential it was to be drilled, and that sharply and systematically, in all the details and processes which comprise that constructive work. And so to become inured to a narrow and abstemious life in so doing. It was good for their characters. It informed and strengthened the minds and spirits of those who were destined to rise. And those who were not should be kept right where they were. Accordingly, about a week after that, the nature of Clyde's work having been finally decided upon, a letter was dispatched to him to Chicago by Samuel Griffiths himself, in which he set forth that if he chose he might present himself any time now within the next few weeks. But he must give due notice in writing of at least 10 days in advance of his appearance in order that he might be properly arranged for. And upon his arrival he was to seek out Mr. Gilbert Griffiths at the office of the mill, who would look after him. And upon receipt of this Clyde was very much thrilled and at once wrote to his mother that he had actually secured a place with his uncle and was going to Lycurgus. Also that he was going to try to achieve a real success now. Whereupon she wrote him a long letter, urging him to be, so careful of his conduct and associates. Bad companionship was at the root of nearly all of the errors and failures that befell an ambitious youth such as he. If he would only avoid evil-minded or foolish and headstrong boys and girls, all would be well. It was so easy for a young man of his looks and character to be led astray by an evil woman. He had seen what had befallen him in Kansas City. But now he was still young and he was going to work for a man who was very rich and who could do so much for him, if he would. And he was to write her frequently as to the outcome of his efforts here. And so, after having notified his uncle as he had requested, Clyde finally took his departure for Lycurgus. But on his arrival there, since his original notification from his uncle had called for no special hour at which to call at the factory, he did not go at once, but instead sought out the important hotel of Lycurgus, the Lycurgus House. Then finding himself with ample time on his hands, and very curious about the character of this city in which he was to work, and his uncle's position in it, he set forth to look it over, his thought being that once he reported and began work he might not soon have the time again. He now ambled out into Central Avenue, the very heart of Lycurgus, which in this section was crossed by several business streets, which together with Central Avenue for a few blocks on either side, appeared to constitute the business center, all there was to the life and gaiety of Lycurgus. Chapter 5. But once in this and walking about, how different it all seemed to the world to which so recently he had been accustomed. For here, as he had thus far seen, all was on a so much smaller scale. The depot, from which only a half-hour before he had stepped down, was so small and dull, untroubled, as he could plainly see, by much traffic. and the factory section which lay opposite the small city, across the Mohawk, was little more than a red and gray assemblage of buildings with here and there a smokestack projecting upward, and connected with the city by two bridges, a half-dozen blocks apart, one of them directly at this depot, a wide traffic bridge across which traveled a car line following the curves of Central Avenue, dotted here and there with stores and small homes. But Central Avenue was quite alive with traffic, pedestrians and automobiles. Opposite diagonally from the hotel, which contained a series of wide plate glass windows, behind which were many chairs interspersed with palms and pillars, was the dry goods emporium of Stark and Company, a considerable affair, 4 stories in height, and of white brick, and at least 100 feet long, the various windows of which seemed bright and interesting, crowded with as smart models as might be seen anywhere. Also there were other large concerns, a second hotel, various automobile showrooms, a moving picture theater. He found himself ambling on and on until suddenly he was out of the business district again and in touch with a wide and tree-shaded thoroughfare of residences, the houses of which, each and every one, appeared to possess more room space, lawn space, general ease and repose and dignity even than any with which he had ever been in contact. In short, as he sensed it from this brief inspection of its very central portion, it seemed a very exceptional, if small city street, rich, luxurious even. So many imposing wrought iron fences, flower-bordered walks, grouped trees and bushes, expensive and handsome automobiles either beneath porte-cochères within or speeding along the broad thoroughfare without. And in some neighboring shops, those nearest Central Avenue and the business heart where this wide and handsome thoroughfare began, were to be seen such expensive-looking and apparently smart displays of the things that might well interest people of means and comfort, motors, jewels, lingerie, leather goods and furniture. But where now did his uncle and his family live? In which house? What street? Was it larger and finer than any of these he had seen in this street? He must return at once, he decided, and report to his uncle. He must look up the factory address, probably in that region beyond the river, and go over there and see him. What would he say, how act, what would his uncle set him to doing? What would his cousin Gilbert be like? What would he be likely to think of him? In his last letter his uncle had mentioned his son Gilbert. He retraced his steps along Central Avenue to the depot and found himself quickly before the walls of the very large concern he was seeking. It was of red brick, 6 stories high, almost 1,000 feet long. It was nearly all windows, at least that portion which had been most recently added and which was devoted to callers. An older section, as Clyde later learned, was connected with the newer building by various bridges. And the south walls of both these two structures, being built at the water's edge, paralleled the Mohawk. There were also, as he now found, various entrances along River Street, 100 feet or more apart, and each one, guarded by an employee in uniform, entrances numbered 1, 2 and 3, which were labeled for employees only, and entrance numbered 4 which read office, and entrances 5 and 6 appeared to be devoted to freight receipts and shipments. Clyde made his way to the office portion and finding no one to hinder him, passed through 2 sets of swinging doors and found himself in the presence of a telephone girl seated at a telephone desk behind a railing, in which was set a small gate, the only entrance to the main office apparently. And this she guarded. She was short, fat, 35 and unattractive. "Well?" she called as Clyde appeared. "I want to see Mr. Gilbert Griffiths," Clyde began a little nervously. "What about?" "Well, you see, I'm his cousin. Clyde Griffiths is my name. I have a letter here from my uncle, Mr. Samuel Griffiths. He'll see me, I think." As he laid the letter before her, he noticed that her quite severe and decidedly indifferent expression changed and became not so much friendly as odd. For obviously she was very much impressed not only by the information but his looks, and began to examine him slyly and curiously. "I'll see if he's in," she replied much more civilly, and plugging at the same time a switch which led to Mr. Gilbert Griffith's private office. Word coming back to her apparently that Mr. Gilbert Griffiths was busy at the moment and could not be disturbed, she called back, "It's Mr. Gilbert's cousin, Mr. Clyde Griffiths. He has a letter from Mr. Samuel Griffiths." Then she said to Clyde, "Won't you sit down? I'm sure Mr. Gilbert Griffiths will see you in a moment. He's busy just now." And Clyde, noting the unusual deference paid him, a form of deference that never in his life before had been offered him, was strangely moved by it. To think that he should be a full cousin to this wealthy and influential family. This enormous factory. So long and wide and high, as he had seen, 6 stories. And walking along the opposite side of the river just now, he had seen through several open windows whole rooms full of girls and women hard at work. And he had been thrilled in spite of himself. For somehow the higher-ed walls of the building suggested energy and very material success, a type of success that was almost without flaw, as he saw it. He looked at the gray plaster walls of this outer waiting chamber, at some lettering on the inner door which read, "The Griffiths Collar and Shirt Company Incorporated, Samuel Griffiths, President Gilbert Griffiths, Saki," and wondered what it was all like inside, what Gilbert Griffiths would be like, cold or genial, friendly or unfriendly. And then, as he sat there meditating, the woman suddenly turned to him and observed, "You can go in now. Mr. Gilbert Griffith's office is at the extreme rear of this floor, over toward the river. Any one of the clerks inside will show you." She half rose as if to open the door for him, but Clyde, sensing the intent, brushed by her. "That's all right. Thanks," he said most warmly, and opening the glass-plated door he gazed upon a room housing many over 100 employees, chiefly young men and young women. And all were apparently intent on their duties before them. Most of them had green shades over their eyes. Quite all of them had on short alpaca office coats or sleeve protectors over their shirt sleeves. Nearly all of the young women wore clean and attractive gingham dresses or office slips. And all about this central space, which was partitionless and supported by round white columns, were offices labeled with the names of the various minor officials and executives of the company, Mr. Smiley, Mr. Latch, Mr. Gotboy, Mr. Berkey. Since the telephone girl had said that Mr. Gilbert Griffiths was at the extreme rear, Clyde, without much hesitation, made his way along the railed-off aisle to that quarter, where upon a half-open door he read, "Mr. Gilbert Griffiths, Saki." He paused, uncertain whether to walk in or not, and then proceeded to tap. At once a sharp, penetrating voice called, "Come," and he entered and faced a youth who looked, if anything, smaller and a little older and certainly much colder and shrewder than himself, such a youth, in short, as Clyde would have liked to imagine himself to be, trained in an executive sense, apparently authoritative and efficient. He was dressed, as Clyde noted at once, in a bright gray suit of a very pronounced pattern, for it was once more approaching spring. His hair, of a lighter shade than Clyde's, was brushed and glazed most smoothly back from his temples and forehead, and his eyes, which Clyde, from the moment he had opened the door had felt drilling him, were of a clear, liquid, grayish-green blue. He had on a pair of large horn-rimmed glasses which he wore at his desk only, and the eyes that peered through them went over Clyde swiftly and notatively, from his shoes to the round brown felt hat which he carried in his hand. "You're my cousin, I believe," he commented, rather icily, as Clyde came forward and stopped, a thin and certainly not very favorable smile playing about his lips. "Yes, I am," replied Clyde, reduced and confused by this calm and rather freezing reception. On the instant, as he now saw, he could not possibly have the same regard and esteem for this cousin, as he could and did have for his uncle, whose very great ability had erected this important industry. Rather, deep down in himself he felt that this young man, an heir and nothing more to this great industry, was taking to himself airs and superiorities which, but for his father's skill before him, would not have been possible. At the same time, so groundless and insignificant were his claims to any consideration here, and so grateful was he for anything that might be done for him, that he felt heavily obligated already and tried to smile his best and most ingratiating smile. Yet Gilbert Griffiths at once appeared to take this as a bit of presumption which ought not to be tolerated in a mere cousin, and particularly one who was seeking a favor of him and his father. However, since his father had troubled to interest himself in him and had given him no alternative, he continued his wry smile and mental examination, the while he said, "We thought you would be showing up today or tomorrow. Did you have a pleasant trip?" "Oh, yes, very," replied Clyde, a little confused by this inquiry. "So you think you'd like to learn something about the manufacture of collars, do you?" Tone and manner were infiltrated by the utmost condescension. "I would certainly like to learn something that would give me a chance to work up, have some future in it," replied Clyde, genially and with a desire to placate his young cousin as much as possible. "Well, my father was telling me of his talk with you in Chicago. From what he told me, I gather that you haven't had much practical experience of any kind. You don't know how to keep books, do you?" "No, I don't," replied Clyde a little regretfully. "And you're not a stenographer or anything like that?" "No, sir, I'm not." Most sharply, as Clyde said this, he felt that he was dreadfully lacking in every training. And now Gilbert Griffiths looked at him as though he were rather a hopeless proposition indeed from the viewpoint of this concern. "Well, the best thing to do with you, I think," he went on, as though before this his father had not indicated to him exactly what was to be done in this case, "is to start you in the shrinking room. That's where the manufacturing end of this business begins, and you might as well be learning that from the ground up. Afterwards, when we see how you do down there, we can tell a little better what to do with you. If you had any office training, it might be possible to use you up here." Clyde's face fell at this and Gilbert noticed it. It pleased him, "But it's just as well to learn the practical side of the business, whatever you do," he added rather coldly, not that he desired to comfort Clyde any but merely to be saying it as a fact. And seeing that Clyde said nothing, he continued, "The best thing, I presume, before you try to do anything around here is for you to get settled somewhere. You haven't taken a room anywhere yet, have you?" "No, I just came in on the noon train," replied Clyde. "I was a little dirty and so I just went up to the hotel to brush up a little. I thought I'd look for a place afterwards." "Well, that's right. Only don't look for any place. I'll have our superintendent see that you're directed to a good boarding house. He knows more about the town than you do." His thought here was that after all Clyde was a full cousin and that it wouldn't do to have him live just anywhere. At the same time, he was greatly concerned lest Clyde get the notion that the family was very much concerned as to where he did live, which most certainly it was not, as he saw it. His final feeling was that he could easily place and control Clyde in such a way as to make him not very important to anyone in any way, his father, the family, all the people who worked here. He reached for a button on his desk and pressed it. A trim girl, very severe and reserved in a green gingham dress, appeared. "Ask Mr. Wiggam to come here." She disappeared and presently there entered a medium-sized and nervous, yet moderately stout, man who looked as though he were under a great strain. He was about 40 years of age, repressed and noncommittal, and looked curiously and suspiciously about as though wondering what new trouble impended. His head, as Clyde at once noticed, appeared chronically to incline forward, while at the same time he lifted his eyes as though actually he would prefer not to look up. "Wiggam," began young Griffiths authoritatively, "this is Clyde Griffiths, a cousin of ours. You remember I spoke to you about him?" "Yes, sir." "Well, he's to be put in the shrinking department for the present. You can show him what he's to do. Afterwards you had better have Mrs. Braley show him where he can get a room." All this had been talked over and fixed upon the week before by Gilbert and Wiggam, but now he gave it the ring of an original suggestion, "And you'd better give his name into the timekeeper as beginning tomorrow morning, see?" "Yes, sir," bowed Wiggam deferentially. "Is that all?" "Yes, that's all," concluded Gilbert smartly. "You go with Wiggam, Mr. Griffiths. He'll tell you what to do." Wiggam turned. "If you'll just come with me, Mr. Griffiths," he observed deferentially, as Clyde could see, and that for all of his cousin's apparently condescending attitude, and marched out with Clyde at his heels. And young Gilbert as briskly turned to his own desk, but at the same time shaking his head. His feeling at the moment was that mentally Clyde was not above a good bellboy in a city hotel probably. Else why should he come on here in this way? "I wonder what he thinks he's going to do here," he continued to think, "where he thinks he's going to get." And Clyde, as he followed Mr. Wiggam, was thinking what a wonderful place Mr. Gilbert Griffiths enjoyed. No doubt he came and went as he chose, arrived at the office late, departed early, and somewhere in this very interesting city dwelt with his parents and sisters in a very fine house, of course. And yet here he was, Gilbert's own cousin, and the nephew of his wealthy uncle, being escorted to work in a very minor department of this great concern. Nevertheless, once they were out of the sight and hearing of Mr. Gilbert Griffiths, he was somewhat diverted from this mood by the sights and sounds of the great manufactory itself. For here on this very same floor, but beyond the immense office room through which he had passed, was another much larger room filled with rows of bins, facing aisles not more than 5 feet wide, and containing, as Clyde could see, enormous quantities of collars boxed in small paper boxes, according to sizes. These bins were either being refilled by stock boys who brought more boxed collars from the boxing room in large wooden trucks, or were being as rapidly emptied by order clerks who, trundling small box trucks in front of them, were filling orders from duplicate checklists which they carried in their hands. "Never worked in a collar factory before, Mr. Griffiths, I presume?" commended Mr. Wiggam with somewhat more spirit, once he was out of the presence of Gilbert Griffiths. Clyde noticed at once the Mr. Griffiths. "Oh, no," he replied quickly. "I never worked at anything like this before. Expect to learn all about the manufacturing end of the game in the course of time, though, I suppose." He was walking briskly along one of the long aisles as he spoke, but Clyde noticed that he shot sly glances in every direction. "I'd like to," he answered. "Well, there's a little more to it than some people think, although you often hear there isn't very much to learn." He opened another door, crossed a gloomy hall and entered still another room which, filled with bins as was the other, was piled high in every bin with bolts of white cloth. "You might as well know a little about this as long as you're going to begin in the shrinking room. This is the stuff from which the collars are cut, the collars and the lining. They are called webs. Each of these bolts is a web. We take these down in the basement and shrink them because they can't be used this way. If they are, the collars would shrink after they were cut. But you'll see. We tub them and then dry them afterwards." He marched solemnly on, and Clyde sensed once more that this man was not looking upon him as an ordinary employee by any means. His Mr. Griffiths, his supposition to the effect that Clyde was to learn all about the manufacturing end of the business, as well as his condescension in explaining about these webs of cloth, had already convinced Clyde that he was looked upon as one to whom some slight homage at least must be paid. He followed Mr. Wiggam, curious as to the significance of this, and soon found himself in an enormous basement which had been reached by descending a flight of steps at the end of a third hall. Here, by the help of 4 long rows of incandescent lamps, he discerned row after row of porcelain tubs or troughs, lengthwise of the room, and end to end, which reached from one exterior wall to the other. And in these, under steaming hot water apparently, were any quantity of those same webs he had just seen upstairs, soaking. And nearby, north and south of these tubs, and paralleling them for the length of this room, all of 150 feet in length, were enormous drying racks or moving skeleton platforms, boxed, top and bottom and sides, with hot steam pipes, between which hung rolls, but festooned in such a fashion as to take advantage of these pipes. Above, below and on either side, were more of these webs, but unwound and wet and draped as described, yet moving along slowly on these rolls from the east end of the room to the west. This movement, as Clyde could see, was accompanied by an enormous rattle and clatter of ratchet arms which automatically shook and moved these lengths of cloth forward from east to west. And as they moved they dried, and were then automatically rewound at the west end of these racks into bolt form once more upon a wooden spool and then lifted off by a youth whose duty it was to take from these moving platforms. One youth, as Clyde saw, took from two of these tracks at the west end, while at the east end another youth of about his own years fed. That is, he took bolts of this now partially shrunk yet still wet cloth and attaching one end of it to some moving hooks, saw that it slowly and properly unwound and fed itself over the drying racks for the entire length of these tracks. As fast as it had gone the way of all webs, another was attached. Between each two rows of tubs in the center of the room were enormous swirling separators or dryers, into which these webs of cloth, as they came from the tubs in which they had been shrinking for 24 hours, were piled and as much water as possible centrifugally extracted before they were spread out on the drying racks. Primarily little more than this mere physical aspect of the room was grasped by Clyde: its noise, its heat, its steam, the energy with which a dozen men and boys were busying themselves with various processes. They were, without exception, clothed only in armless undershirts, a pair of old trousers belted in at the waist, and with canvas-topped and rubber-soled sneakers on their bare feet. The water and the general dampness and the heat of the room seemed obviously to necessitate some such dressing as this. "This is the shrinking room," observed Mr. Wiggam, as they entered. "It isn't as nice as some of the others, but it's where the manufacturing process begins. Kemmerer," he called. A short, stocky, full-chested man, with a pate, full face and white, strong-looking arms, dressed in a pair of dirty and wrinkled trousers and an armless flannel shirt, now appeared. Like Wiggam in the presence of Gilbert, he appeared to be very much overawed in the presence of Wiggam. "This is Clyde Griffiths, the cousin of Gilbert Griffiths. I spoke to you about him last week, you remember?" "Yes, sir. He's to begin down here. He'll show up in the morning." "Yes, sir. Better put his name down on your checklist. He'll begin at the usual hour." "Yes, sir." Mr. Wiggam, as Clyde noticed, held his head higher and spoke more directly and authoritatively than at any time so far. He seemed to be master, not underling, now. 7:30 is the time everyone goes to work here in the morning, went on Mr. Wiggam to Clyde informatively, but they all ring in a little earlier, about 7:20 or so as to have time to change their clothes and get to the machines. "Now, if you want to," he added, "Mr. Kemmerer can show you what you'll have to do tomorrow before you leave today. It might save a little time. Or, you can leave it until then if you want to. It don't make any difference to me. Only, if you'll come back to the telephone girl at the main entrance about 5:30, I'll have Mrs. Braley there for you. She's to show you about your room, I believe. I won't be there myself, but you just ask the telephone girl for her. She'll know." He turned and added, "Well, I'll leave you now." He lowered his head and started to go away just as Clyde began. "Well, I'm very much obliged to you, Mr. Wiggam." Instead of answering, he waved one fishy hand slightly upward and was gone, down between the tubs toward the west door. And at once Mr. Kemmerer, still nervous and overawed apparently, began. "Oh, that's all right about what you have to do, Mr. Griffiths. I'll just let you bring down webs on the floor above to begin with tomorrow. But if you've got any old clothes, you'd better put 'em on. A suit like that wouldn't last long here." He eyed Clyde's very neat, if inexpensive suit, in an odd way. His manner, quite like that of Mr. Wiggam before him, was a mixture of uncertainty and a very small authority here in Clyde's case, of extreme respect and yet some private doubt, which only time might resolve. Obviously it was no small thing to be a Griffiths here, even if one were a cousin and possibly not as welcome to one's powerful relatives as one might be at first sight, and considering what his general dreams in connection with this industry were, Clyde was inclined to rebel. For the type of youth and man he saw here were in his estimation and at first glance rather below the type of individuals he hoped to find here, individuals neither so intelligent nor alert as those employed by the Union League and the Green Davidson by a long distance. And still worse, he felt them to be much more subdued and sly and ignorant, mere clocks, really. And their eyes, as he entered with Mr. Wiggam, while they pretended not to be looking, were very well aware, as Clyde could feel, of all that was going on. Indeed, he and Mr. Wiggam were the center of all their secret looks. At the same time, their spare and practical manner of dressing struck dead at one blow any thought of refinement in connection with the work in here. How unfortunate that his lack of training would not permit his being put to office work or something like that upstairs. He walked with Mr. Kemmerer, who troubled to say that these were the tubs in which the webs were shrunk overnight, these the centrifugal dryers, these the rack dryers. Then he was told that he could go. And by then it was only 3 o'clock. He made his way out of the nearest door, and once outside he congratulated himself on being connected with this great company, while at the same time wondering whether he was going to prove satisfactory to Mr. Kemmerer and Mr. Wiggam. Supposing he didn't? Or supposing he couldn't stand all this? It was pretty rough. Well, if worst came to worst, as he now thought, he could go back to Chicago, or on to New York, maybe, and get work. But why hadn't Samuel Griffiths had the graciousness to receive and welcome him? Why had that young Gilbert Griffiths smiled so cynically? And what sort of a woman was this Mrs. Braley? Had he done wisely to come on here? Would this family do anything for him now that he was here? It was thus that, strolling west along River Street, on which were a number of other kinds of factories, and then north through a few other streets that held more factories, tinware, viscwire, a big vacuum carpet cleaning plant, a rug manufacturing company, and the like, that he came finally upon a miserable slum, the like of which, small as it was, he had not seen outside of Chicago or Kansas City. He was so irritated and depressed by the poverty and social angularity and crudeness of it, all spelling but one thing, social misery, to him, that he at once retraced his steps and recrossing the Mohawk by a bridge farther west soon found himself in an area which was very different indeed, a region once more of just such homes as he had been admiring before he left for the factory. And walking still farther south, he came upon that same wide and tree-lined avenue, which he had seen before, the exterior appearance of which alone identified it as the principal residence thoroughfare of Lycurgus. It was so very broad and well paved and lined by such an arresting company of houses. At once he was very much alive to the personnel of this street, for it came to him immediately that it must be in this street very likely that his Uncle Samuel lived. The houses were nearly all of French, Italian or English design, and excellent period copies at that, although he did not know it. Impressed by their beauty and spaciousness, however, he walked along, now looking at one and another, and wondering which, if any, of these was occupied by his uncle, and deeply impressed by the significance of so much wealth. How superior and condescending his cousin Gilbert must feel, walking out of some such place as this in the morning. Then pausing before one which, because of trees, walks, newly groomed if bloomless flower beds, a large garage at the rear, a large fountain to the left of the house as he faced it, in the center of which was a boy holding a swan in his arms, and to the right of the house one lone cast-iron stag pursued by some cast-iron dogs, he felt especially impelled to admire, and charmed by the dignity of this place, which was a modified form of Old English. He now inquired of a stranger who was passing, a middle-aged man of a rather shabby working type, "Whose house is that, mister?" And the man replied, "Why, that's Samuel Griffith's residence. He's the man who owns the big collar factory over the river." At once Clyde straightened up, as though dashed with cold water. His uncle's. His residence. Then that was one of his automobiles standing before the garage at the rear there. And there was another visible through the open door of the garage. Indeed, in his immature and really psychically unilluminated mind it suddenly evoked a mood which was as of roses, perfumes, lights and music. The beauty. The ease. What member of his own immediate family had ever even dreamed that his uncle lived thus? The grandeur. And his own parents so wretched, so poor, preaching on the streets of Kansas City and no doubt Denver. Conducting a mission. And although thus far no single member of this family other than his chill cousin had troubled to meet him, and that at the factory only, and although he had been so indifferently assigned to the menial type of work that he had, still he was elated and uplifted. For, after all, was he not a Griffiths, a full cousin as well as a full nephew to the two very important men who lived here, and now working for them in some capacity at least? And must not that spell a future of some sort, better than any he had known as yet? For consider who the Griffiths were here, as opposed to who the Griffiths were in Kansas City, say, or Denver. The enormous difference. A thing to be as carefully concealed as possible. At the same time, he was immediately reduced again, for supposing the Griffiths here, his uncle or his cousin or some friend or agent of theirs, should now investigate his parents and his past? Heavens! The matter of that slain child in Kansas City. His parents' miserable makeshift life. Esta. At once his face fell, his dreams being so thickly clouded over. If they should guess. If they should sense. Oh, the devil, who was he anyway? And what did he really amount to? What could he hope for from such a great world as this really, once they knew why he had troubled to come here? A little disgusted and depressed he turned to retrace his steps, for all at once he felt himself very much of a nobody. Chapter 6. The room which Clyde secured this same day with the aid of Mrs. Braley, was in Thorpe Street, a thoroughfare enormously removed in quality if not in distance from that in which his uncle resided. Indeed, the difference was sufficient to decidedly qualify his mounting notions of himself as one who, after all, was connected with him. The commonplace brown or gray or tan-colored houses, rather smoked or decayed, which fronted it, the leafless and winter-harried trees which in spite of smoke and dust seemed to give promise of the newer life so near at hand, the leaves and flowers of May. Yet as he walked into it with Mrs. Braley, many drab and commonplace figures of men and girls, and elderly spinsters resembling Mrs. Braley in kind, were making their way home from the several factories beyond the river. And at the door Mrs. Braley and himself were received by a none too polished woman in a clean gingham apron over a dark brown dress, who led the way to a second-floor room, not too small or uncomfortably furnished, which she assured him he could have for $4 without board or $7.50 with, a proposition which, seeing that he was advised by Mrs. Braley that this was somewhat better than he would get in most places for the same amount, he decided to take. And here, after thanking Mrs. Braley, he decided to remain, later sitting down to dinner with a small group of Milltown store and factory employees, such as partially he had been accustomed to in Paulina Street in Chicago, before moving to the better atmosphere of the Union League. And after dinner he made his way out into the principal thoroughfares of Lycurgus, only to observe such a crowd of nondescript mill workers as, judging these streets by day, he would not have fancied swarmed here by night, girls and boys, men and women of various nationalities and types, Americans, Poles, Hungarians, French, English, and for the most part, if not entirely touched with a peculiar something, ignorance or thickness of mind or body, or with a certain lack of taste and alertness or daring, which seemed to mark them one and all as of the basement world which he had seen only this afternoon. Yet in some streets and stores, particularly those nearer Waikiki Avenue, a better type of girl and young man who might have been and no doubt were of the various office groups of the different companies over the river, neat and active. And Clyde, walking to and fro, from 8 until 10, when as though by pre-arrangement, the crowd in the more congested streets seemed suddenly to fade away, leaving them quite vacant. And throughout this time contrasting it all with Chicago and Kansas City. What would Ratterer think if he could see him now, his uncle's great house and factory? And perhaps because of its smallness, liking it, the Lycurgus Hotel, neat and bright and with a brisk local life seeming to center about it. And the post office and a handsomely spired church, together with an old and interesting graveyard, cheek by jowl with an automobile sales room. And a new moving picture theater just around the corner in a side street. And various boys and girls, men and women, walking here and there, some of them flirting as Clyde could see. And with a suggestion somehow hovering over it all of hope and zest and youth, the hope and zest and youth that is at the bottom of all the constructive energy of the world everywhere. And finally returning to his room in Thorpe Street with the conclusion that he did like the place and would like to stay here. That beautiful Waikiki Avenue. His uncle's great factory. The many pretty and eager girls he had seen hurrying to and fro. In the meantime, insofar as Gilbert Griffiths was concerned, and in the absence of his father, who was in New York at the time, a fact which Clyde did not know and of which Gilbert did not trouble to inform him, he had conveyed to his mother and sisters that he had met Clyde, and if he were not the dullest, certainly he was not the most interesting person in the world, either. Encountering Myra, as he first entered at 5:30, the same day that Clyde had appeared, he troubled to observe, "Well, that Chicago cousin of ours blew in today." "Yes," commented Myra. "What's he like?" The fact that her father had described Clyde as gentlemanly and intelligent had interested her, although knowing Lycurgus and the nature of the mill life here and its opportunities for those who worked in factories such as her father owned, she had wondered why Clyde had bothered to come. "Well, I can't see that he's so much," replied Gilbert. "He's fairly intelligent and not bad-looking, but he admits that he's never had any business training of any kind. He's like all those young fellows who work for hotels. He thinks clothes are the whole thing, I guess. He had on a light brown suit and a brown tie and hat to match and brown shoes. His tie was too bright and he had on one of those bright pink striped shirts like they used to wear 3 or 4 years ago. Besides, his clothes aren't cut right. I didn't want to say anything because he's just come on, and we don't know whether he'll hold out or not. But if he does, and he's going to pose around as a relative of ours, he'd better tone down, or I'd advise the governor to have a few words with him. Outside of that, I guess he'll do well enough in one of the departments after a while, as foreman or something. He might even be made into a salesman later on, I suppose. But what he sees in all that to make it worthwhile to come here is more than I can guess. As a matter of fact, I don't think the governor made it clear to him just how few the chances are here for anyone who isn't really a wizard or something." He stood with his back to the large open fireplace. "Oh, well, you know what Mother was saying the other day about his father. She thinks Daddy feels that he's never had a chance in some way. He'll probably do something for him whether he wants to keep him in the mill or not. She told me that she thought that Dad felt that his father hadn't been treated just right by their father." Myra paused, and Gilbert, who had had this same hint from his mother before now, chose to ignore the implication of it. "Oh, well, it's not my funeral," he went on. "If the governor wants to keep him on here whether he's fitted for anything special or not, that's his lookout. Only he's the one that's always talking about efficiency in every department and cutting and keeping out dead timber." Meeting his mother and Bella later, he volunteered the same news and much the same ideas. Mrs. Griffiths sighed, for after all, in a place like Lycurgus and established as they were, anyone related to them and having their name ought to be most circumspect and have careful manners and taste and judgment. It was not wise for her husband to bring on anyone who was not all of that and more. On the other hand, Bella was by no means satisfied with the accuracy of her brother's picture of Clyde. She did not know Clyde, but she did know Gilbert, and as she knew he could decide very swiftly that this or that person was lacking in almost every way, when, as a matter of fact, they might not be at all as she saw it. "Oh, well," she finally observed, after hearing Gilbert comment on more of Clyde's peculiarities at dinner, "if Daddy wants him, I presume he'll keep him, or do something with him eventually." At which Gilbert winced internally, for this was a direct slap at his assumed authority in the mill under his father, which authority he was eager to make more and more effective in every direction, as his younger sister well knew. In the meanwhile, on the following morning, Clyde, returning to the mill, found that the name, or appearance, or both perhaps, his resemblance to Mr. Gilbert Griffiths, was of some peculiar advantage to him which he could not quite sufficiently estimate at present. For on reaching number 1 entrance, the doorman on guard there looked as though startled. "Oh, you're Mr. Clyde Griffiths?" he queried. "You're going to work under Mr. Kemmerer?" "Yes, I know. Well, that man there will have your key," and he pointed to a stodgy, stuffy old man whom later Clyde came to know as Old Jeff, the time clock guard, who, at a stand farther along this same hall, furnished and reclaimed all keys between 7:30 and 7:40. When Clyde approached him and said, "My name's Clyde Griffiths and I'm to work downstairs with Mr. Kemmerer," he too started and then said, "Sure, that's right. Yes, sir. Here you are, Mr. Griffiths. Mr. Kemmerer spoke to me about you yesterday. Number 71 is to be yours. I'm giving you Mr. Duvney's old key." When Clyde had gone down the stairs into the shrinking department, he turned to the doorman who had drawn near and exclaimed, "Don't it beat all how much that fellow looks like Mr. Gilbert Griffiths? Why, he's almost his spit image. What is he, do you suppose, a brother or a cousin, or what?" "Don't ask me," replied the doorman. "I never saw him before. But he's certainly related to the family all right. When I seen him first, I thought it was Mr. Gilbert. I was just about to tip my hat to him when I saw it wasn't." And in the shrinking room when he entered, as on the day before, he found Kemmerer as respectful and evasive as ever. For, like Wiggam before him, Kemmerer had not as yet been able to decide what Clyde's true position with this company was likely to be. For, as Wiggam had informed Kemmerer the day before, Mr. Gilbert had said no least thing which tended to make Mr. Wiggam believe that things were to be made especially easy for him, nor yet hard, either. On the contrary, Mr. Gilbert had said, he's to be treated like all the other employees as to time and work. No different. Yet in introducing Clyde he had said, "This is my cousin, and he's going to try to learn this business," which would indicate that as time went on Clyde was to be transferred from department to department until he had surveyed the entire manufacturing end of the business. Wiggam, for this reason, after Clyde had gone, whispered to Kemmerer as well as to several others, that Clyde might readily prove to be someone who was a protégé of the chief, and therefore they determined to watch their step, at least until they knew what his standing here was to be. And Clyde, noticing this, was quite set up by it, for he could not help but feel that this in itself, and apart from whatever his cousin Gilbert might either think or wish to do, might easily presage some favor on the part of his uncle that might lead to some good for him. So when Kemmerer proceeded to explain to him that he was not to think that the work was so very hard or that there was so very much to do for the present, Clyde took it with a slight air of condescension. And in consequence Kemmerer was all the more respectful. "Just hang up your hat and coat over there in one of those lockers," he proceeded mildly and ingratiatingly even. "Then you can take one of those crate trucks back there and go up to the next floor and bring down some webs. They'll show you where to get them." The days that followed were diverting and yet troublesome enough to Clyde, who to begin with was puzzled and disturbed at times by the peculiar social and workaday worlds and position in which he found himself. For one thing, those by whom now he found himself immediately surrounded at the factory were not such individuals as he would ordinarily select for companions, far below bellboys or drivers or clerks anywhere. They were, one and all, as he could now clearly see, meaty or stodgy mentally and physically. They wore such clothes as only the most common laborers would wear, such clothes as are usually worn by those who count their personal appearance among the least of their troubles, their work and their heavy material existence being all. In addition, not knowing just what Clyde was, or what his coming might mean to their separate and individual positions, they were inclined to be dubious and suspicious. After a week or two, however, coming to understand that Clyde was a nephew of the president, a cousin of the secretary of the company, and hence not likely to remain here long in any menial capacity, they grew more friendly, but inclined in the face of the sense of subserviency which this inspired in them, to become jealous and suspicious of him in another way. For, after all, Clyde was not one of them, and under such circumstances could not be. He might smile and be civil enough, yet he would always be in touch with those who were above them, would he not, or so they thought. He was, as they saw it, part of the rich and superior class, and every poor man knew what that meant. The poor must stand together everywhere. For his part, however, and sitting about for the first few days in this particular room eating his lunch, he wondered how these men could interest themselves in what were to him such dull and uninteresting items, the quality of the cloth that was coming down in the webs, some minute flaws in the matter of weight or weave. The last 20 webs hadn't looked so closely shrunk as the preceding 16, or the Cranston Visquire Company was not carrying as many men as it had the month before, or the Anthony Wooden Ware Company had posted a notice that the Saturday half-holiday would not begin before June 1st this year as opposed to the middle of May last year. They all appeared to be lost in the humdrum and routine of their work. In consequence, his mind went back to happier scenes. He wished at times he were back in Chicago or Kansas City. He thought of Ratterer, Helland, Higby, Louise Ratterer, Larry Doyle, Mr. Squires, Hortense, all of the young and thoughtless company of which he had been a part, and wondered what they were doing. What had become of Hortense? She had got that fur coat after all, probably from that cigar clerk, and then had gone away with him after she had protested so much feeling for him, the little beast. After she had gotten all that money out of him. The mere thought of her and all that she might have meant to him if things had not turned as they had, made him a little sick at times. To whom was she being nice now? How had she found things since leaving Kansas City? And what would she think if she saw him here now or knew of his present high connections? Gee! That would cool her a little. But she would not think much of his present position. That was true. But she might respect him more if she could see his uncle and his cousin and this factory and their big house. It would be like her then to try to be nice to him. Well, he would show her. If he ever ran into her again, snub her, of course, as no doubt he very well could by then. Chapter 7. In so far as his life at Mrs. Cuppy's went, he was not so very happily placed there, either. For that was but a commonplace rooming and boarding house, which drew to it, at best, such conservative mill and business types as looked on work and their wages, and the notions of the middle-class religious world of Lycurgus as most essential to the order and well-being of the world. From the point of view of entertainment or gaiety, it was in the main a very dull place. At the same time, because of the presence of one Walter Dillard, a brainless sprig who had recently come here from Fonda, it was not wholly devoid of interest for Clyde. The latter, a youth of about Clyde's own age and equally ambitious socially, but without Clyde's tact or discrimination anent the governing facts of life, was connected with the men's furnishing department of Stark and Company. He was spry, avid, attractive enough physically, with very light hair, a very light and feeble mustache, and the delicate airs and ways of a small-town Beau Brummel. Never having had any social standing or the use of any means whatsoever, his father having been a small-town dry goods merchant before him, who had failed, he was, because of some atavistic spur or fillip in his own blood, most anxious to attain some sort of social position. But failing that so far, he was interested in and envious of those who had it, much more so than Clyde, even. The glory and activity of the leading families of this particular city had enormous weight with him, the Nicholsons, the Starks, the Harriets, Griffiths, Finchleys, etc. And learning a few days after Clyde's arrival of his somewhat left-handed connection with this world, he was most definitely interested. What? A Griffiths? The nephew of the rich Samuel Griffiths of Lycurgus. And in this boarding house. Beside him at this table. At once his interest rose to where he decided that he must cultivate this stranger as speedily as possible. Here was a real social opportunity knocking at his very door, a connecting link to one of the very best families. And besides, was he not young, attractive and probably ambitious like himself, a fellow to play around with if one could? He proceeded at once to make overtures to Clyde. It seemed almost too good to be true. In consequence he was quick to suggest a walk, The fact that there was a certain movie just on at the Mohawk, which was excellent, very snappy. Didn't Clyde want to go? And because of his neatness, smartness, a touch of something that was far from humdrum or the heavy practicality of the mill in the remainder of this boarding house world, Clyde was inclined to fall in with him. But, as he now thought, here were his great relatives and he must watch his step here. Who knew but that he might be making a great mistake in holding such free and easy contacts as this? The Griffiths, as well as the entire world of which they were a part, as he guessed from the general manner of all those who even contacted him, must be very removed from the commonalty here. More by instinct than reason, he was inclined to stand off and look very superior, more so since those, including this very youth on whom he practiced this, seemed to respect him the more. And although upon eager, and even, after its fashion, supplicating request, he now went with this youth, still he went cautiously. And his aloof and condescending manner Dillard at once translated as class and connection. And to think he had met him in this dull, dubby boarding house here. And on his arrival, at the very inception of his career here. And so his manner was that of the sycophant, although he had a better position and was earning more money than Clyde was at this time, $22 a week. "I suppose you'll be spending a good deal of your time with your relatives and friends here," he volunteered on the occasion of their first walk together, and after he had extracted as much information as Clyde cared to impart, which was almost nothing, while he volunteered a few, most decidedly furbished bits from his own history. His father owned a dry goods store now. He had come over here to study other methods, etc. He had an uncle here, connected with Stark and Company. He had met a few, not so many as yet, nice people here, since he hadn't been here so very long himself, 4 months all told. But Clyde's relatives. "Say your uncle must be worth over $1 million, isn't he?" "They say he is. Those houses in Waikiki Avenue are certainly the cat's. You won't see anything finer in Albany or Utica or Rochester either. Are you Samuel Griffith's own nephew? You don't say? Well, that'll certainly mean a lot to you here. I wish I had a connection like that. You bet I'd make it count." He beamed on Clyde eagerly and hopefully, and through him Clyde sensed even more how really important this blood relation was. Only think how much it meant to this strange youth. "Oh, I don't know," replied Clyde dubiously, and yet very much flattered by this assumption of intimacy. "I came on to learn the collar business, you know. Not to play about very much. My uncle wants me to stick to that, pretty much." Sure. I know how that is," replied Dillard. "That's the way my uncle feels about me, too. He wants me to stick close to the work here and not play about very much. He's the buyer for Stark and Company, you know. But still a man can't work all the time, either. He's got to have a little fun." "Yes, that's right," said Clyde, for the first time in his life a little condescendingly. They walked along in silence for a few moments. Then, "Do you dance?" "Yes," answered Clyde. "Well, so do I. There are a lot of cheap dance halls around here, but I never go to any of those. You can't do it and keep in with the nice people. This is an awfully close town that way. They say the best people won't have anything to do with you unless you go with the right crowd. It's the same way up at Fonda. You have to belong or you can't go out anywhere at all. And that's right, I guess. But still there are a lot of nice girls here that a fellow can go with, girls of right nice families, not in society, of course, but still, they're not talked about, see? And they're not so slow, either. Pretty hot stuff, some of them. And you don't have to marry any of them, either." Clyde began to think of him as perhaps a little too lusty for his new life here, maybe. At the same time he liked him some. "By the way," went on Dillard, "what are you doing next Sunday afternoon?" "Well, nothing in particular, that I know of just now," replied Clyde, sensing a new problem here. "I don't know just what I may have to do by then, but I don't know of anything now." "Well, how'd you like to come with me, if you're not too busy? I've come to know quite a few girls since I've been here. Nice ones. I can take you out and introduce you to my uncle's family, if you like. They're nice people. And afterwards, I know two girls we can go and see, Peaches. One of 'em did work in the store, but she don't now, she's not doing anything now. The other is her pal. They have a Victrola and they can dance. I know it isn't the thing to dance here on Sundays, but no one need know anything about that. The girl's parents don't mind. Afterwards we might take him to a movie or something, if you want to, not any of those things down near the Mill District but one of the better ones, see? There formulated itself in Clyde's mind the question as to what, in regard to just such proposals as this, his course here was to be. In Chicago, and recently, because of what happened in Kansas City, he had sought to be as retiring and cautious as possible. For, after that and while connected with the club, he had been taken with the fancy of trying to live up to the ideals with which the seemingly stern face of that institution had inspired him: conservatism, hard work, saving one's money, looking neat and gentlemanly. It was such an eveless paradise, that, in spite of his quiet surroundings here, however, the very air of the city seemed to suggest some such relaxation as this youth was now suggesting, a form of diversion that was probably innocent enough but still connected with girls and their entertainment. There were so many of them here, as he could see. These streets, after dinner, here, were so alive with good-looking girls, and young men, too. But what might his new-found relatives think of him in case he was seen stepping about in the manner and spirit which this youth's suggestions seemed to imply? Hadn't he just said that this was an awfully close town and that everybody knew nearly everything about everybody else? He paused in doubt. He must decide now. And then, being lonely and hungry for companionship, he replied, "Yes, well, I think that's all right." But he added a little dubiously, "Of course my relatives here." "Oh, sure, that's all right," replied Dillard smartly. "You have to be careful, of course." "Well, so do I." If he could only go around with the Griffiths, even if he was new around here and didn't know many people, wouldn't it reflect a lot of credit on him? It most certainly would, did already, as he saw it. And forthwith he offered to buy Clyde some cigarettes, a soda, anything he liked. But Clyde, still feeling very strange and uncertain, excused himself, after a time, because this youth with his complacent worship of society and position, annoyed him a little, and made his way back to his room. He had promised his mother a letter and he thought he had better go back and write it, and incidentally to think a little on the wisdom of this new contact. Chapter 8. Nevertheless, the next day being a Saturday and half-holiday the year round in this concern, Mr. Wiggam came through with the pay envelopes. "Here you are, Mr. Griffiths," he said, as though he were especially impressed with Clyde's position. Clyde, taking it, was rather pleased with this mistering, and going back toward his locker, promptly tore it open and pocketed the money. After that, taking his hat and coat, he wandered off in the direction of his room, where he had his lunch. But, being very lonely, and Dillard not being present because he had to work, he decided upon a trolley ride to Gloversville, which was a city of some 20,000 inhabitants and reported to be as active, if not as beautiful, as Lycurgus. And that trip amused and interested him because it took him into a city very different from Lycurgus in its social texture. But the next day, Sunday, he spent idly in Lycurgus, wandering about by himself. For, as it turned out, Dillard was compelled to return to Fonda for some reason and could not fulfill the Sunday understanding. Encountering Clyde, however, on Monday evening, he announced that on the following Wednesday evening, in the basement of the Digby Avenue Congregational Church, there was to be held a social with refreshments. And according to young Dillard, at least this promised to prove worthwhile. "We can just go out there," was the way he put it to Clyde, "and buzz the girls a little. I want you to meet my uncle and aunt. They're nice people all right. And so are the girls. They're no slouches. Then we can edge out afterwards, about 10, see, and go around to either Zella or Rita's place. Rita has more good records over at her place, But Zella has the nicest place to dance. By the way, you didn't chance to bring along your dress suit with you, did you?" he inquired. For having already inspected Clyde's room, which was above his own on the third floor, in Clyde's absence and having discovered that he had only a dress suitcase and no trunk, and apparently no dress suit anywhere, he had decided that in spite of Clyde's father conducting a hotel and Clyde having worked in the Union League Club in Chicago, he must be very indifferent to social equipment. Or, if not, must be endeavoring to make his own way on some character-building plan without help from anyone. This was not to his liking, exactly. A man should never neglect these social essentials. Nevertheless, Clyde was a Griffiths and that was enough to cause him to overlook nearly anything, for the present anyhow. "No, I didn't," replied Clyde, who was not exactly sure as to the value of this adventure, even yet, in spite of his own loneliness, "but I intend to get one." He had already thought since coming here of his lack in this respect, and was thinking of taking at least 35 of his more recently hard-earned savings and indulging in a suit of this kind. Dillard buzzed on about the fact that while Zella Schumann's family wasn't rich, they owned the house they lived in, still she went with a lot of nice girls here, too. So did Rita Dickerman. Zella's father owned a little cottage upon Eckert Lake, near Fonda. When next summer came, and with it the holidays and pleasant weekends, he and Clyde, supposing that Clyde liked Rita, might go up there sometime for a visit, for Rita and Zella were inseparable almost. And they were pretty, too. Zella's dark and Rita's light, he added enthusiastically. Clyde was interested by the fact that the girls were pretty and that out of a clear sky and in the face of his present loneliness, he was being made so much of by this Dillard. But, was it wise for him to become very much involved with him? That was the question, for, after all, he really knew nothing of him. And he gathered from Dillard's manner, his flighty enthusiasm for the occasion, that he was far more interested in the girls as girls, a certain freedom or concealed looseness that characterized them, than he was in the social phase of the world which they represented. And wasn't that what brought about his downfall in Kansas City? Here in Lycurgus, of all places, he was least likely to forget it, aspiring to something better as he now did. Nonetheless, at 8:30 on the following Wednesday evening, they were off, Clyde full of eager anticipation. And by 9 o'clock they were in the midst of one of those semi-religious, semi-social and semi-emotional church affairs, the object of which was to raise money for the church, the general service of which was to furnish an occasion for gossip among the elders, criticism and a certain amount of enthusiastic, if disguised courtship and flirtation among the younger members. There were booths for the sale of quite everything from pies, cakes and ice cream to laces, dolls and knickknacks of every description, supplied by the members and parted with for the benefit of the church. The Reverend Peter Israels, the minister, and his wife were present. Also Dillard's uncle and aunt, a pair of brisk and yet uninteresting people whom Clyde could sense were of no importance socially here. They were too genial and altogether social in the specific neighborhood sense, although Grover Wilson, being a buyer for Stark and Company, endeavored to assume a serious and important air at times. He was an undersized and stocky man who did not seem to know how to dress very well or could not afford it. In contrast to his nephew's almost immaculate garb, his own suit was far from perfect fitting. It was unpressed and slightly soiled. And his tie the same. He had a habit of rubbing his hands in a clerkly fashion, of wrinkling his brows and scratching the back of his head at times, as though something he was about to say had cost him great thought and was of the utmost importance. Whereas, nothing that he uttered, as even Clyde could see, was of the slightest importance. And so, too, with the stout and large Mrs. Wilson, who stood beside him while he was attempting to rise to the importance of Clyde. She merely beamed a fatty beam. She was almost ponderous, and pink, with a tendency to a double chin. She smiled and smiled, largely because she was naturally genial and on her good behavior here, but incidentally because Clyde was who he was. For as Clyde himself could see, Walter Dillard had lost no time in impressing his relatives with the fact that he was a Griffiths. Also that he had encountered and made a friend of him and that he was now chaperoning him locally. "Walter has been telling us that you have just come on here to work for your uncle. You're at Mrs. Cuppy's now, I understand. I don't know her but I've always heard she keeps such a nice, refined place. Mr. Parsley, who lives here with her, used to go to school with me. But I don't see much of him anymore. Did you meet him yet?" "No, I didn't," said Clyde in return. "Well, you know, we expected you last Sunday to dinner, only Walter had to go home. But you must come soon. Any time at all. I would love to have you." She beamed and her small grayish-brown eyes twinkled. Clyde could see that because of the fame of his uncle he was looked upon as a social find, really. And so it was with the remainder of this company, old and young, the Reverend Peter Israels and his wife, Mr. Micah Bumpus, a local vendor of printing inks, and his wife and son, Mr. and Mrs. Maximilian Pick, Mr. Pick being a wholesale and retail dealer in hay, grain and feed, Mr. Witness, a florist, and Mrs. Throop, a local real estate dealer. All knew Samuel Griffiths and his family by reputation, and it seemed not a little interesting and strange to all of them that Clyde, a real nephew of so rich a man, should be here in their midst. The only trouble with this was that Clyde's manner was very soft and not as impressive as it should be, not so aggressive and contemptuous. And most of them were of that type of mind that respects insolence even where it pretends to condemn it. Insofar as the young girls were concerned, it was even more noticeable. For Dillard was making this important relationship of Clyde's perfectly plain to everyone. "This is Clyde Griffiths, the nephew of Samuel Griffiths, Mr. Gilbert Griffiths' cousin, you know. He's just come on here to study the collar business in his uncle's factory." And Clyde, who realized how shallow was this pretense, was still not a little pleased and impressed by the effect of it all. This Dillard's effrontery. The brassy way in which, because of Clyde, he presumed to patronize these people. On this occasion, he kept guiding Clyde here and there, refusing for the most part to leave him alone for an instant. In fact, he was determined that all whom he knew and liked among the girls and young men should know who and what Clyde was and that he was presenting him. Also that those whom he did not like should see as little of him as possible, not be introduced at all. "She don't amount to anything. Her father only keeps a small garage here. I wouldn't bother with her if I were you. Or, he isn't much around here. Just a clerk in our store." At the same time, in regard to some others, he was all smiles and compliments, or at worst apologetic for their social lacks. And then he was introduced to Zella Schumann and Rita Dickerman, who, for reasons of their own, not the least among which was a desire to appear a little wise and more sophisticated than the others here, came a little late. And it was true, as Clyde was to find out afterwards, that they were different, too, less simple and restricted than quite all of the girls whom Dillard had thus far introduced him to. They were not as sound religiously and morally as were these others. And as even Clyde noted on meeting them, they were as keen for as close an approach to pagan pleasure without admitting it to themselves, as it was possible to be and not be marked for what they were. And in consequence, there was something in their manner, the very spirit of the introduction, which struck him as different from the tone of the rest of this church group, not exactly morally or religiously unhealthy but rather much freer, less repressed, less reserved than were these others. "Oh, so you're Mr. Clyde Griffiths," observed Zella Schumann. "My, you look a lot like your cousin, don't you? I see him driving down Central Avenue ever so often. Walter has been telling us all about you. Do you like Lycurgus?" The way she said Walter, together with something intimate and possessive in the tone of her voice, caused Clyde to feel at once that she must feel rather closer to and freer with Dillard than he himself had indicated. A small scarlet bow of velvet ribbon at her throat, 2 small garnet earrings in her ears, a very trim and tight-fitting black dress, with a heavily flounced skirt, seemed to indicate that she was not opposed to showing her figure, and prized it, a mood which except for a demure and rather retiring poise which she affected, would most certainly have excited comment in such a place as this. Rita Dickerman, on the other hand, was lush and blonde, with pink cheeks, light chestnut hair, and bluish-gray eyes. Lacking the aggressive smartness which characterized Zella Schumann, she still radiated a certain something which to Clyde seemed to harmonize with the liberal if secret mood of her friend. Her manner, as Clyde could see, while much less suggestive of masked bravado, was yielding and to him designedly so, as well as naturally provocative. It had been arranged that she was to intrigue him. Very much fascinated by Zella Schumann and in tow of her, they were inseparable. And when Clyde was introduced to her, she beamed upon him in a melting and sensuous way which troubled him not a little. For here in Lycurgus, as he was telling himself at the time, he must be very careful with whom he became familiar. And yet, unfortunately, as in the case of Hortense Briggs, she evoked thoughts of intimacy, however unproblematic or distant, which troubled him. But he must be careful. It was just such a free attitude as this suggested by Dillard as well as these girls' manners that had gotten him into trouble before. "Now we'll just have a little ice cream and cake," suggested Dillard, after the few preliminary remarks were over, "and then we can get out of here. You two had better go around together and hand out a few hellos. Then we can meet at the ice cream booth. After that, if you say so, we'll leave, eh? What do you say?" He looked at Zella Schumann as much as to say, "You know what is the best thing to do," and she smiled and replied, "That's right. We can't leave right away. I see my cousin Mary over there. And Mother. And Fred Bruckner. Rita and I'll just go around by ourselves for a while and then we'll meet you, see?" And Rita Dickerman forthwith bestowed upon Clyde an intimate and possessive smile. After about 20 minutes of drifting and browsing, Dillard received some signal from Zella, and he and Clyde paused near the ice cream booth with its chairs in the center of the room. In a few moments they were casually joined by Zella and Rita, with whom they had some ice cream and cake. And then, being free of all obligations and as some of the others were beginning to depart, Dillard observed, "Let's beat it. We can go over to your place, can't we?" "Sure, sure," whispered Zella, and together they made their way to the coat room. Clyde was still so dubious as to the wisdom of all this that he was inclined to be a little silent. He did not know whether he was fascinated by Rita or not. But once out in the street out of view of the church and the homing amusement seekers, he and Rita found themselves together, Zella and Dillard having walked on ahead. And although Clyde had taken her arm, as he thought fit, she maneuvered it free and laid a warm and caressing hand on his elbow. And she nudged quite close to him, shoulder to shoulder, and half leaning on him, began pattering of the life of Lycurgus. There was something very furry and caressing about her voice now. Clyde liked it. There was something heavy and languorous about her body, a kind of ray or electron that intrigued and lured him in spite of himself. He felt that he would like to caress her arm and might if he wished, that he might even put his arm around her waist, and so soon. Yet here he was, a Griffiths, he was shrewd enough to think, a Lycurgus Griffiths, and that was what now made a difference, that made all those girls at this church social seem so much more interested in him and so friendly. Yet in spite of this thought, he did squeeze her arm ever so slightly and without reproach or comment from her. And once in the Schumann home, which was a large old-fashioned square frame house with a square cupola, very retired among some trees and a lawn, they made themselves at home in a general living room which was much more handsomely furnished than any home with which Clyde had been identified heretofore. Dillard at once began sorting the records, with which he seemed most familiar, and to pull two rather large rugs out of the way, revealing a smooth, hardwood floor. "There's one thing about this house and these trees and these soft-toned needles," he commented for Clyde's benefit, of course, since he was still under the impression that Clyde might be and probably was a very shrewd person who was watching his every move here. "You can't hear a note of this Victrola out in the street, can you, Zell? Nor upstairs, either, really, not with the soft needles. We've played it down here and danced to it several times, Until 3 and 4 in the morning, and they didn't even know it upstairs, did they, Zell? That's right. But then father's a little hard of hearing. And mother don't hear anything, either, when she gets in her room and gets to reading. But it is hard to hear at that. Why do people object so to dancing here? Asked Clyde. Oh, they don't, not the factory people, not at all, put in Dillard, but most of the church people do. My uncle and aunt do. And nearly everyone else we met at the church tonight, except Zell and Rita. He gave them a most approving and encouraging glance. And they're too broad-minded to let a little thing like that bother them. Ain't that right, Zell? This young girl, who was very much fascinated by him, laughed and nodded. You bet, that's right. I can't see any harm in it. Nor me, either, put in Rita, nor my father and mother. Only they don't like to say anything about it or make me feel that they want me to do too much of it. Dillard by then had started a piece entitled Brown Eyes, and immediately Clyde and Rita and Dillard and Zella began to dance, and Clyde found himself insensibly drifting into a kind of intimacy with this girl which boded he could scarcely say what. She danced so warmly and enthusiastically, a kind of weaving and swaying motion which suggested all sorts of repressed enthusiasms. And her lips were at once wreathed with a kind of lyric smile which suggested a kind of hunger for this thing. And she was very pretty, more so dancing and smiling than at any other time. She is delicious, thought Clyde, even if she is a little soft. Any fellow would do almost as well as me, but she likes me because she thinks I'm somebody. And almost at the same moment she observed, isn't it just too gorgeous? And you're such a good dancer, Mr. Griffiths. Oh, no, he replied, smiling into her eyes, you're the one that's the dancer. I can dance because you're dancing with me. He could feel now that her arms were large and soft, her bosom full for one so young. Exhilarated by dancing, she was quite intoxicating, her gestures almost provoking. Now we'll put on the love boat, called Dillard the moment Brown Eyes was ended, and you and Zella can dance together and Rita and I will have a spin, eh, Rita? He was so fascinated by his own skill as a dancer, however, as well as his natural joy in the art, that he could scarcely wait to begin another, but must take Rita by the arms before putting on another record, gliding here and there, doing steps and executing figures which Clyde could not possibly achieve and which at once established Dillard as the superior dancer. Then, having done so, he called to Clyde to put on the love boat. But as Clyde could see after dancing with Zella once, this was planned to be a happy companionship of two mutually mated couples who would not interfere with each other in any way, but rather would aid each other in their various schemes to enjoy one another's society. For while Zella danced with Clyde, and danced well and talked to him much, all the while he could feel that she was interested in Dillard and Dillard only and would prefer to be with him. For, after a few dances, and while he and Rita lounged on a settee and talked, Zella and Dillard left the room to go to the kitchen for a drink. Only, as Clyde observed, they stayed much longer than any single drink would have required. And similarly, during this interval, it seemed as though it was intended even, by Rita, that he and she should draw closer to one another. For, finding the conversation on the settee lagging for a moment, she got up and apropos of nothing, no music and no words, motioned him to dance some more with her. She had danced certain steps with Dillard which she pretended to show Clyde. But because of their nature, these brought her and Clyde into closer contact than before, very much so. And standing so close together and showing Clyde by elbow and arm how to do, her face and cheek came very close to him, too much for his own strength of will and purpose. He pressed his cheek to hers and she turned smiling and encouraging eyes upon him. On the instant, his self-possession was gone and he kissed her lips. And then again, and again. And instead of withdrawing them, as he thought she might, she let him remain just as she was in order that he might kiss her more. And suddenly now, as he felt this yielding of her warm body so close to him, and the pressure of her lips in response to his own, he realized that he had let himself in for a relationship which might not be so very easy to modify or escape. Also that it would be a very difficult thing for him to resist, since he now liked her and obviously she liked him.